Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm going to give you just a moment to start to get settled in, and I'm going to go ahead and make some introductions. I am really, really excited about the program that's getting started right now. I'm Julie Moose. I'm the executive director of the National Press Club Journalism Institute, and I am so happy to be here with you producing this program in partnership with our professional development team led by Rachel Oswald, to whom I'm very grateful for helping to bring all of us together. So welcome to Where We Live, covering the intersection of housing and racism. Thanks for making the time to be here, and thank you to the Gannett Foundation, whose support is allowing us to offer this program to you at no cost. So this is going to be a very informative program, packed with a lot of specifics and a lot of insights. So I just want you to know ahead of time, we're recording it. We will provide you with a link to the recording later today. So just know that you'll have that. If you're not as fast taking notes, it's okay. It will be captured for you. We'll also publish a recap later today in our newsletter, so you can get the highlights that way as well. And we hope that you will share the video with others who you feel like would also be interested in this program. So we want this to be as valuable to you as possible, and we hope that you'll have questions. So please do add them in the Q&A queue. We'll also be putting resources, thanks to Rachel and to Holly Butcher-Grant, in the chat throughout the program. So do keep an eye on that as well. And we're going to get the conversation started. So I'm really thrilled to introduce our panel today. I'm going to introduce them alphabetically. They're all wonderful. So we'll start with Michael Brice-Saddler, who covers DC government and politics for the Washington Post. And then Alexandria Burris, a business reporter for the IndyStar in Indianapolis, who recently reported on racial bias in the home appraisal industry. We have Lauren Lindstrom, a reporter for the Charlotte Observer and a Report for America Corps member who covers housing and homelessness. We have Dan Reed, a writer, urban planner, and community advocate whose writing has appeared in the Washingtonian, the New York Times, and many other places. And our moderator, Kristen Capps, a writer for CityLab, Bloomberg CityLab, who's focused on housing, architecture, and the built environment. So thank you so much to our panel for being here, for sharing your expertise. And now over to you, Kristen.
Well, thanks. It's great to be here, and I'm so glad to be joined by these panelists. When I was thinking about this topic, I feel like the way that race manifests most expressly in my own work is that I'm talking frequently to developers who are usually white. I'm talking frequently to tenants who are people of color often, and the developers have spokespeople and the tenants never do. And usually if I'm at the point where I'm talking with a tenant, it's not because they have a great rental situation. That stark power differential is something that I try to be mindful of in my work every day. So I kind of want to ask a few of you, what are the kind of obstacles that you face when you're in centering community in your own work? And that's a broad question. I'd start with Alexandria. What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, so for me, it's always been just looking at how the newsrooms I've been in are practicing journalism, how they've historically practiced journalism. Typically in those newsrooms, we don't really cover people like underserved communities, whether they're Black, Hispanic, the Burmese community. We have a Burmese community here in Indianapolis. We don't really cover them when we talk about housing. So we talk about it from the point of the developer or, the white residents who come to the council meetings, and that's where the coverage stops. So there kind of has to be, or there really needs to be, like a change in how we think about our journalism, the mindsets that we use, how we understand our communities and why people live where they live. So we're just not playing catch up when we're trying to do stories of death, stories about bias and race, and hoping that people we've never talked to before talk to them. And so I'd say definitely the mindset of the newsroom, the journalism, has been an obstacle.
How do you, just to follow up on that, how do you handle as a reporter a room of older, more likely men, more likely white residents who are, complaining about a topic? And when you're there to cover that meeting, how do you kind of balance that with people who aren't present, whose voices aren't in that room?
So my default point has always been to start with who's not there. That's my first thought, is who's missing from this conversation. And part of that goes back to my own experience and being in communities and living in communities, growing up in communities where gentrification has and is taking place, and having zero voice. My neighbors and I having zero voice in how it's happening. Nobody knocks on our door to access how we feel about the big development moving in. Nobody asked my cousins how they felt when, developers from New Orleans, I'm from Louisiana, New Orleans came to my city and decided to build luxury apartments in their neighborhood and rebrand the neighborhood under a new name. And so I always think about like, who's missing and how do I find them? And I start there.
Michael, I want to kick it to you. What are some of the obstacles that you face frequently that you're thinking about in your reporting?
Sure. Yeah. So as someone who covers politics more broadly in the district, I think when I look at housing, it's something that so many policies permeate people who are living in communities, especially impoverished communities in the district. And when I started on the beat about a year ago, I really set out to make sure that we were paying attention to all facets of city life, not just what's happening in the neighborhoods where many of us live in, but also if you're familiar with the district east of the Anacostia River, some of the most historically underserved communities in the city. And as I've started to get a better picture of the housing situation across the city and the impacts of gentrification, I have been almost a bit overwhelmed at times at the number of viable, interesting, compelling situations involving tenants, involving developers, involving decisions on where we're building in the city and how it affects those who've lived here for decades and generations and how they feel about all of it. And I just find myself wishing there were like 6 or 7 of me sometimes to be able to give light to all of these different concerns that are happening. But one thing I do think I appreciate about being at the Post, we actually just created a new position recently on someone who's focused on housing and gentrification in the DMV, which I think is much needed. But is that we do try to center those tenant and resident perspectives in our reporting in a really meaningful way. And I think actually just this past week, I'm sure a lot of you saw there was national news about the shooting that happened adjacent to Nationals Park. And my colleague Marissa, who has assumed that role covering housing and gentrification, she launched on a story and I thought executed it really beautifully about how longtime residents who've lived in that area, the stadium is actually located very closely to a lot of low income communities, but you wouldn't know that if you stayed just right in the blocks around the stadium where there's all these posh restaurants and kind of high rise buildings. But the residents who are living just outside of that say, hey, like, this shooting was certainly scary, but the reality for us is we've had these concerns for a really long time. And as the area has become increasingly gentrified, we feel like our voices have become lost in how developers are changing this community and where they build and what it means for us. And one tenant even mentioned how with the construction that's taking place nearby in some of these high rises, the debris is like wafting into their windows. And I'm like, this is compelling. So I think the biggest challenge I have is just, I get so many emails from residents and people who are dealing with problematic landlords who feel their needs haven't been met by the city and the agencies that are supposed to enforce housing, good housing conditions, and just wanting to tell all of those stories and not being able to get to all of them, but trying to make sure that it's reflected in the other stories that I do in accountability reporting as well when it comes to those city agencies.
we're both residents of Washington, D.C., or I'm a resident of Washington, D.C., and you report on Washington, D.C. So I don't want to focus too much on it, but the story you're talking about that Marissa wrote kind of almost played out in a different way last night too. As you probably know, there was a shooting on 14th Street, which is a kind of a luxury corridor in DC, and I think a lot of residents expressed some shock that this happened, and then I think there was a bit of a backlash to that among people saying, well, this happens very frequently in places like Congress Heights. Do you think that criticism is fair, that we're not hearing enough from those neighborhoods and those communities who are struggling with this kind of issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a complicated dialogue, because when you're looking at social media and who's talking about what,
yeah,
oftentimes those who are engaging in these conversations, who might be out on 14th Street at any given time eating dinner or at happy hour or brunch, if you're largely following people who are dining there and living there, then you're going to see what's happening to them, and that conversation is going to be amplified in a way that feels disproportionate. So I think it's unfair for people to say that there isn't shock and outrage over what's happening in Congress Heights and other areas of the city. I think of the 6-year-old who was killed last week, and there was certainly, if you're in those communities, you would know just how much shock and outrage there was, but you might not see that on your social media feed, depending on who you're following and who's using these apps and who has access even to the phones to be using these apps. So I think that needs to be part of the conversation as well, but it certainly, I understand why so many people felt frustrated when you see Anderson Cooper in this segment on CNN about the shooting on 14th Street, when there are so many shootings. The Post just did a story this week also about how 40% of all shootings in the city are concentrated on just a handful of blocks, 2% of the city overall. Right. And this is a daily reality for so many people. So I don't want to get too tangential into shootings and whatnot, but it is a fascinating conversation, and not the first time it's played out, and it certainly won't be the last time.
Lauren, maybe you can talk to us about obstacles in your own community and some of the trends that you're reporting, some of the issues that you're tackling.
Yeah, so I live in Charlotte, North Carolina. This beat was new when I got here. So figuring out what is a housing beat in Charlotte in 2019 when I arrived was kind of a conversation with me in my newsroom. Charlotte is kind of in a transformative period, much like most of the Southeast, of saying, what are we as a 21st century city? It's certainly a city that is growing rapidly in size and wealth and development. And what does that mean for the folks that were already here, have been here a long time, or who are coming here and are not on banking salaries? And so for me, the conversation around building a beat is, what are those big topics that we're going to cover, not in an individual story capacity, but over months and longer. And so for me, it's been a combination of tracking both public and private money that's spent around housing. How efficiently do we use that money? How many units are we getting for it? Is it getting targeted to the lowest incomes? Even nonprofit affordable housing developers would say that the math is really, really hard to build units that are for the absolute lowest incomes. And so they compensate with that with either market rate or very high subsidized levels, as well as displacement. And, looking at neighborhoods that have historically been more middle and lower income, historically Black neighborhoods. And as folks push out further into the community because home prices are growing just like everywhere else in the country, who is, one, left out of the real estate market, and two, who's getting pushed out of it. And so Charlotte's in an interesting place right now. And I was new to Charlotte when I got here and new to the beat. And so it was definitely a learning experience along with it. And I think, as Alexandria said, learning the neighborhoods and the geography of where you live and what neighborhoods, quote unquote, used to be called, and the rebranding of them, mostly by developers or new residents. And then, learning, is that what we as the paper are going to call them? has been, incredibly informative to me. And so I think just figuring out what is a housing beat and making sure that equity is at the center of it has been kind of not an obstacle so much for me, but I would say it's certainly a challenge that I think we in our newsroom are called to take up and hopefully continue to do a better job of.
That's a good point for a transition to talk about our newsrooms themselves, not just our reporting out in the world. I'm, at my place, I'm very fortunate to work with an editor who has a lot of experience reporting on policing. So as someone who hasn't really done that work, it's really useful to have the benefit of her insights there. But as I know that you all know, there is in any newsroom some up management that happens where as reporters we're teaching some editors who don't have our particular experience or experiences. And for me myself, I'm mindful. I need to be mindful of my own blind spots when it comes to systems and dynamics that I'm not part of. So I want to ask Dan, as someone who does a lot of writing for a lot of different places, how do you kind of negotiate a newsroom when you're not necessarily there, in that room?
Sure. So, as a freelancer, I've worked with lots of different kinds of publications, and in general, I've found that more general interest, publications, it's often harder to make a case for writing about racial equity in housing, or even putting that as like a frame to a story. Like, it requires a little bit more handholding. When I've written for, I don't know what you'd call it, like industry publications that like target urban planners or just nerds who are interested in urban planning, it's a lot easier to make that jump. And I think it's starting to change. I would also add that like a lot of it comes down to like who are subscribing to these publications, right? I think the assumption is that the reader, the person who's getting the subscriptions and sits down on Sunday morning with the entire paper and spreads it all out, is usually like an older, affluent, white, homeowning family, right? And a lot of stories are either presented from that perspective or for their consumption, right? We've talked about how developers often are given a lot of perspective in stories, but so do these older white homeowners, right? Like, anytime you see a story that says such and such thing is controversial, or such and such people have raised concerns, well, who raised those concerns, right? Especially in the context of like a neighborhood fight or something. It's usually people who have the time and the money and the means to go to public hearings, to testify, to start an organization, to have signs or whatever. And that often feeds like a little loop with the people who are perceived as the audience for these publications. And it's interesting, and I hate to make it again about the DC area, we have a massive Black middle class here and people of color middle class, right? And that sort of gets lost in a lot of stories that are either about, this affluent white neighborhood is keeping something bad out, or this thing is being imposed on a poor Black neighborhood, right? Like, we have an entire third population here that has become like ascendant in the past 30 years. They have agency, but are rarely perceived as either the audience for or the subject of a lot of reporting on housing issues.
Alex, at the very beginning of this chat, you talked about the newsroom itself, and I'd love to hear kind of your experience in navigating the newsroom when it comes to these issues of reporting on racial equity.
Sure. So in my experience, at this moment, we're sort of dealing with editors who are very much there's very much a concern of what will our white readers think. And that's the default. It's not every editor, but there are editors, as we are trying to expand our coverage and sort of right a lot of the mistakes that the publications that I've worked for have made in the past. That's where their default is. And so they may suggest that certain phrases be taken out because it will make our subscribers more comfortable. That's great for them, but that's not my priority. I think the truth is the truth. And, we have to have an appetite to understand the history of our communities and why people live where they live and who is there at every socioeconomic level. And so for me, I'm sorry, what was the question again? I got nervous.
Wanted to understand your experience of the newsroom and how, you negotiate with editors who maybe don't have that same priority you're describing.
Oh, yeah, so for me, I've learned to just stand my ground because like I said, it's not my priority to make people comfortable. I feel like I am trying to help them better understand the communities. I am trying to present them the truth, and sometimes the truth is uncomfortable in itself. And so when I have these conversations with editors, and it's typically during the editing process, I have to feel like I have to protect my story a bit. I just have to stand my ground. I've learned to anyway. So that's where I stand. Sorry, that was disjumbled.
No. That's a great answer. Michael, do you know that this tension? Do you feel a tension when it comes to you understanding who your reader is, whether that's the subscriber to the Washington Post that kind of Dan mentioned, or communities who maybe don't have the same access to the media sphere we participate in?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I feel at the Post, at least I'll speak for the publication I work at, then when I pitch stories focused on racial equity, I think so much of what's happening in the district right now can be told through a racial equity lens, and it's a priority for a lot of lawmakers as well. So to omit that conversation from a story would be a dereliction of my own duties. And I don't think my editors ever really oppose that or push back on that in a way that I've felt has made me uncomfortable. I think there are times where I like to make sure we know kind of, as Alex alluded to, who is the audience we're prioritizing. And I think that conversation is an important one to remember, looking back to who a lot of the editors who were here decades ago were focusing on. You have largely white male editors, so you're thinking through that lens, and the tide has shifted so drastically now. But I don't think that in a place like the Post that's been around for so long, it's completely been eradicated. So I think a lot of the duty does fall on reporters sometimes to make sure we're righting that ship and we're remembering who we're reporting for and why, and what audiences we're prioritizing and why. And it's not just the people who subscribe to our paper. It's the people also that we're writing about. And one of the things that stuck out to me, so I'm from Baltimore, and in 2017, I interned at the Baltimore Sun, and that was my first internship at a major newspaper. And I remember I was a crime reporter, and I remember going out and about in communities and knocking on doors after shootings happened and things like that, and people being so surprised that there was a Black Baltimore Sun reporter knocking on their doorstep. Like, it was a shock to them in a predominantly Black city that a Black reporter was knocking on their doorstep. And it was so jarring to me. The mayor at the time even said, like, I hope they hire you because we need more Black reporters in this city. I think the representation is so key. That doesn't mean stories can't be told by, white people and people of different races. But when we're talking about Black cities like DC and Baltimore, having representation is so key, because the people who are willing to share those stories with you, if you look like them, it can make a huge difference. If it's someone who looks like them, who's showing the paper, showing they care and are willing to invest in a reporter that looks like them, that builds that trust. And if you have a city with a majority Black population and you have no reporters of color covering issues in the community, it's going to create tension. It's going to raise questions and create a barrier. So for me, I guess I think there needs to be continued investment in making sure that the staffs of the newspapers are representative of the communities they're trying to cover. And that will really help knock down some of the barriers and make it easier to know who you're writing for, because they'll be part of the staff that's doing the writing.
Yeah, that's that's a really interesting point. We have a question from a participant about the advice that we might give young reporters. And while you were talking, Michael, I was thinking about when I was like a younger reporter and living on U Street in DC and living in a predominantly, or at least living in a community with a large Ethiopian population. I kind of really regret not learning more about that community that really no longer lives there, and not having a source for reporting on the immigrant community that was living there. So I'd ask, maybe Dan could talk about like what advice you would give to younger reporters who want to cover racial equity, who want to center these issues where they live.
I think the first piece of advice I would give is to push back against what you just said, is that the Ethiopian community doesn't live in DC anymore. They moved across the street and live in Maryland, literally, right? And I think that perspective is crucial, to take that regional idea of how a region works, right? And that it is, I think culturally in this country, we still have this perception that like the city is where all the Black and brown people live and the white people are this invading force, and in the suburbs where all the white people live. And like, we all know that's not true anymore. And a lot of younger reporters, they just get started. A lot of them come to a city for the first time from a different place. They may move to a place where other young people live, right? Or where it is more affordable. And their perspective may often be shaped by those initial experiences of a place, which I think makes it even more crucial to get out there beyond the neighborhoods that are familiar, beyond the neighborhoods that the paper's already talking about, and even out into the suburbs, and to really try and get as full a picture as possible as how the region works, right? Because for people who live here, the conception of DC isn't just like the 10-mile square, but like people who live 30 or 40 miles away and still have an intimate relationship with the city because they're commuting in to go work some dead-end job at a convenience store or something, right? They are part of this story too, and I would really push it on young reporters to be like, get out there and put some miles on your car or some money on your Metro card, and like really take in like the breadth of this amazing place that you're reporting on.
Lauren, where you live, are you spending enough time in the suburbs? How would you, this is a new beat for you and for the city, if I understand it right. So what are some of the early lessons that you've learned covering?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I've been most interested in tracking and is looking at some of the close-in neighborhoods that outside of the immediate central city that have historically been, predominantly Black, predominantly, I would say, like what we would consider, moderately priced houses, somewhere, 1,400 square feet, what we would call these starter homes. And they were built and created at this time when in the 60s and 70s, folks used to live much closer to the central city. And then the city of Charlotte instituted its urban renewal program, which happened all over the country, but, clearing out neighborhoods that were historically Black in order to make way for whatever they wanted to do with it. So those new neighborhoods in the 60s and 70s developed. And now, again, we're seeing now in the 2010s, 2020s, that they're changing over again. And people are being priced out of those neighborhoods that they've lived in for 60 plus years. And I think for me, getting to know those neighborhoods and the history of those neighborhoods, particularly as Alexandria said, they might get rebranded, right? A new development comes in and we get this cutesy little like 2-syllable nickname of I now live, south of whatever. And you're like, well, that neighborhood had a name before, right? Like that neighborhood had a long history and it was, named for a certain prominent community member. And now, when a developer puts out we're building townhomes, wherever, it's not called that anymore. And so for me, like being new to the city, it's been incredibly useful to get to know elders in neighborhoods, either neighborhood associations or in religious organizations or, local like community organizations to try to inform my reporting with historical context, because so much has changed in Charlotte in the last even 10 years, much less 30 years, that you could really look at the city now and ignore a whole lot of history and do a big disservice to readers about like, this neighborhood just popped up. And they're like, well, not really. And so for me, that's been something that's been really helpful for me to try to like catch up. And also Charlotte is so full of transplants that I think a lot of our readers don't have that historical context either, because there's a lot of young people and a lot of new folks that are coming to the city. And so, if the readers don't have it either, then like, who are we serving?
We have a question from our participant who said, one particular challenge in television news is getting people willing to go on camera to discuss their housing situation. It can make that human storytelling a bit more difficult. I don't think that any of us is doing broadcast news that way, but talking with tenants who maybe don't have experience, who are in vulnerable situations, who are dealing with precarity in their lives is something I think that we all probably do talk about a lot. So Alex, how do you, do your job, get people to talk with you while, being mindful of the vulnerability that they are bringing to a story?
Sure, I think, I try to explain as much of my reporting process beforehand. If I know I'm going to meet someone in person, I let them know that I am bringing a photographer with me, that we will be getting video, that we will, place a mic. We'll have to get close to them and place a mic on them because we do multimedia on our website. And I find that makes people who are typically inexperienced with our journalism and how we report more comfortable. They tend to prepare ahead of time how they're going to present themselves and stuff like that. And so I always make sure that they have that option. So I think just being comfortable with people and also listening. You can go a really long way if you just listen to people. The more you listen to them, the more you just let them talk. They'll get comfortable with you and they'll tell you their story. Like I find that people actually want to talk. Surprisingly, I don't get a lot of people who say no because if by the time I get to them, whatever issue that they're dealing with their housing, their apartments or their homes, they've been dealing with it for a really long time and they're frustrated. So
Right. To kind of talk about those frustrations, it seems like it's building to a head really nationwide right now, as we're all looking at the end of the federal eviction moratorium. Since this is this is a panel about housing, that's got to be on our minds. Michael, how are you approaching that in your work, and what's that look like for you?
Yeah, so you mean in terms of the eviction moratorium?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so for the past few months, there's been a really interesting, I guess I should say past half year at least, since we've been the pandemic has quote unquote been winding down, and we've been exploring what the future of the protections that were put in place because of the pandemic look like. There's been a really interesting debate among advocates, tenants, and developers and landlords and members of the council about what the future should look like in terms of some of these protections that are in place. And the council actually just recently voted to extend certain protections. Well, in a sense, it's kind of nuanced, but they basically are trying to create more of a soft landing for tenants. So it's not just this abrupt, evictions can launch again immediately after the public health emergency is expired, but going all the way into next year, like we're going to create certain exceptions where eviction filings might be able to start up again, but largely there are a number of steps that a landlord needs to take before they could even start that process. And one of the most fundamental aspects of that is this program the city has rolled out to help tenants during the pandemic called State EC, that basically helps with rent payments, back rent and future rent payments for those who maybe have lost their job or need some type of assistance. But the rollout of that has been a bit problematic. And a lot of council members in DC have pointed out that either the application has been too confusing or the payments aren't arriving in time. So there's been a lot of scrutiny about this program that they're tying to the end of evictions and whether it's actually the dollars that it's supposed to provide are actually getting into the pockets of the people who need them. So this is something we've been tracking really closely in our reporting. And as the council has debated this issue, and there have been hours-long hearings about the efficacy of the program and what programs should be in place for tenants who are vulnerable and are even put in a more vulnerable position because of what they've dealt with during the pandemic. I guess making sure we're incorporating those voices into our coverage and staying up to date on updates, and also explaining in plain English what's going to happen over the next 6-7 months has been kind of how we on the local government team here in DC have tried to approach the end of the eviction moratorium.
Lauren, maybe you could talk about what the end of the federal eviction moratorium means in Charlotte, and how you're kind of shaping your reporting around evictions and homelessness and the kinds of issues that are kind of very currently happening.
Yeah, so I've been doing a lot of thought about how you cover this in real time, because it's going to start happening really fast. And I think the thing that I am most interested in getting, so as a precursor, North Carolina courts are not particularly in this century. It is very difficult to get court records online in big data. I mean, individual cases, but like as far as getting large sums of data that will show you trends and things like that, it's very difficult. And so I've been working with colleagues of mine from publications around Charlotte there's actually an affordable housing journalism collaborative here. And so we have been multiplying our working power, which has been really great to like manually go through eviction records that actually happened during the pandemic to see kind of who was still getting evicted. And I think going forward, it will be our job to not just say evictions are happening and they were happening during the pandemic, but who was getting evicted. Because I think, to go back to the equity issue, it's disingenuous to just say we're expecting evictions to happen on a huge level, but they are not going to affect the same communities, the same income levels, the same, neighborhoods uniformly. There's going to be a huge difference because folks were already on a very different playing field as far as their resources with savings and ability to stay home during the pandemic or get laid off or don't get laid off. So we're going to see a lot of disproportionate impacts on different communities. And so I think as we're telling those stories, if we don't include the racial equity aspect of it, like we are not doing our jobs to say, they're happening in neighborhoods that are overwhelmingly, particularly in our community, it's going to be Black and Hispanic neighborhoods based on what we've seen so far. Just knowing like the demographics of the zip codes and census tracts they're in. And so it's not a race blind issue to say evictions are happening and everyone has the same odds of getting evicted. Like that's just not the case. And so going forward, that will definitely be a priority of ours here in Charlotte.
A question came through about records and what type of records you look for to talk about issues like gentrification, like displacement. It's an interesting question that I think that probably each of us is dealing with a little bit in a little bit of a different way. Dan, do you have any ideas?
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite resources has been, looking through the archives of old newspapers here. I mean, you can, with a library card, you can access the entire Washington Post archives for free going back to 1877. And it's really great to put, a context, not just last year, the year before that, but like going back to like the 40s. Here are decisions that were made 60 or 70 years ago that impact this community today, right? And really being able to recreate some of the institutional knowledge that gets lost when, especially at the local level, reporters tend to do that, and they go on to what's perceived as a more prestigious job somewhere else. So newspaper archives are often really useful for voices that either aren't present today or to provide context for how things happened, from a very long-term perspective. The other thing I think is really useful for is that the same stories keep getting told over and over again, right? Like the template of wealthy neighborhood is mad about this thing, goes back to decades ago, right? There's a corner store in my neighborhood that I found an article from 1936 where the neighbors say this is going to cause moral rot because the kids can buy candy there as they leave the school. Terrible. Right? And we're still writing those stories today, just different characters and slightly different language.
Michael, I like this question. What are the records that you use in your work to cover equity in communities?
Yeah, I think I kind of want to echo Dan's sentiment about just looking at what has been touched on when you have a property or a building that maybe people are complaining about now. So I think of tenants who are experiencing issues that they might write to a newspaper about or talk to people about, mold or negligent landlords or property managers. I've come to find in my time on this beat that usually, especially with older buildings, it's probably not the first time people living there have had these types of complaints. And a couple of months ago, I did a story about a building in Ward 8 known as Marbury Plaza. And I was just fascinated looking at the history of this particular building because back in the 80s and 90s, it was, I should say probably more so the 80s, it was known as this paradise for the Black middle class and elite in DC. Isaac Hayes had an apartment there. It was seen as this really shining place for up and coming business folk to go. You didn't live there if you didn't have clout in some way, is what I was told. And then over the years, it just slowly fell into disrepair. And as I was looking through the Post's own archives, which are still available on our website, some of our reporting about this building, you could see even my own editor, who's no longer my editor, but when I talked to her, I pitched the story about Marbury Plaza because there was about a week where the air conditioning was out in June, and it was probably one of the hottest weeks of the year in DC, and there were tenants complaining about the lack of air conditioning. And I wanted to pursue it as a story just to tell people about what was going on. And she's like, "Oh yeah, I know about Marbury Plaza. This is not new." And it's fascinating to be able to tell the story through this lens of why is this still such a problem years later when it was a problem 10 years ago, when it was a problem 15 years ago, when crime and blighted parts of the building were such a highlight in 15 years ago. So I really like Dan's note about just seeing what's been written about communities in the past, seeing what's been written about buildings in the past, and making sure you're not approaching a situation that has been historically a problem from a new lens when it's not applicable. And that also can help with accountability when you're going to city officials and when you're going to those responsible property managers and owners to ask those difficult questions about what has changed. And if it's not anything meaningful, then why not?
Alex, I'll kick this question down to you. What are some records you use to do your reporting? I'm halfway asking because I'm just going to steal everyone's ideas, but I do want to hear.
Yeah, so I wrote a story a couple of months ago about a Black woman here in Indianapolis who tried to get her home. Well, she sought home appraisal. She wanted to refinance and suspected that there was bias in the appraisal process.
Right.
Part of that story, and I'd like to think one of the reasons it was impactful was because I did manage to include some of the history of her neighborhood. And for me, I got that from talking to local historians at IUPUI who they have found just troves of records on how this community formed and who lived there. And that includes census records. And so that's a big part of how I do my research. And then individually also just using census records to see where people have lived and where they're moving over time. That's another resource you can look at. Recently, our paper published a story about a housing complex that is primarily inhabited by the Latino community and the Burmese community, and many people who don't speak English as a first language, but there are actual records of violations that the city has that go back until like 2017. So that's another place to get records from. Yeah, there's so many places to look. Some of it, I think you just have to put a little brain power behind it, but they're there. Newspaper archives as well. We have a historically Black newspaper in our city, and it is an immense source of understanding and reporting on communities that the IndyStar typically has not reported on.
I'll add my own little tip that people can steal, and that is to, if you're fortunate enough to work at a publication with the resources, to get to know the lawyers who work where you work. I, as a kind of national reporter, I do a lot of Freedom of Information Act filing in really different cities. So I'm never quite aware of, I'm never fully like cognizant of what the process is when you're bouncing from LA to New York and from state to city to county. So, having a good relationship with the lawyers is really useful, so they can kind of like work through this. But also, at a past publication when, I got rejected on an important story about Hudson Yards and the financing for that development, the lawyers kind of pushed back on that rejection, and that just the legal threat was enough to get them to move on the records, and it helped me break an important story. So I want to dip more into the Q&A here, and I'm not sure if I see it. Oh yeah, someone had a question about covering immigrant communities. This is a question specifically about covering Latinx communities. I think it pertains to fears about that people with different citizenship status have about talking with a reporter, and the effect that might have of that on them. In Latinx communities, there may be special vulnerability, since tenants, for example, might not feel that they can go through the same legal challenges or the same legal channels to pursue complaints against landlords, for example. So I'll ask just the panel if anyone has any advice on how, as a reporter, you work with these communities to make sure their stories are told when they feel like they need some protection.
Sure, I'll go first.
Thanks.
I'll actually explain what my colleague did. She's a wonderful person, her name's Natalia Contreras. She moved here from Texas and realized that the IndyStar was not covering the Latino community at all. And she launched a Spanish language newsletter, and it's been really successful. Yes, there are difficulties, and you do want to take care when dealing with people who do have sensitivities about their status. Here in Indianapolis, and Natalia has been great in bringing me in and helping other reporters connect to a coalition of people within the Latino community that kind of formed out of COVID. They would gather and they would make sure that they would gather to meet and then collect information and exchange information that they could, and resources that they could take back to people in their communities who were afraid to maybe come
Right.
to step forward because of their immigration status. And they've also been a really good resource for us in terms of connecting us to different groups. They've been advocates for housing and healthcare and everything else like that. So on another level, since I covered general business, Amazon was one of the topics that I covered, employers that I covered during the pandemic, and undocumented workers within the warehouses were my best sources. They would point me in the direction of where I could find actual information on the record. And so talk to them.
Great. I've seen this question come up in the thread like a couple of different ways. So I'm going to try to do my best to blend it together. And it's about financial literacy. Reporting on racial equity, reporting on systemic racism means dealing with a lot of power and a lot of money. So I want to get a sense of how you deal with, really complex financial topics. What are some of your sources? What is some of your advice when navigating, multi-million-dollar real estate deals, complex litigation, that kind of aspect of this work? And I guess I'd start with Dan.
I think it helps to understand as much context as you can get to it. A project can evolve over time. It can have many different players. It can linger, it can stall, it can die and come back. And I often find those twists and turns are like often the most interesting part, like because there are real personalities involved, and like a really interesting or really significant project can fall apart because two people had a spat with each other. And that can have real consequences. So before I even form an opinion on a project, like I want to get as much depth and context about like how and why it came to be here before anything else.
What do you feel, maybe this is a craft question. This one is something that comes up for me a lot, but like low income housing tax credits, like all the acronyms that we deal with, how do you write around them in a way that doesn't lose the reader? It doesn't kind of circumnavigate the communities we're talking about through legalese.
One of my first like paid writing gigs was I edited Greater Washington. It was the first staff editor of Greater Washington, which is a DC area regional blog that covers planning issues. And its audience, and I say this with love, are nerds. And most of our writers are volunteers, and so my job was to help translate like really interesting stuff about local things that were happening into something that a more lay audience could understand. And a lot of that was dealing with acronyms. And the easiest way I found to deal with that is to like just take out the acronym and like try to describe this in as plain English as possible. Low income housing tax credits. Okay, developers get tax credits that make it easier to build affordable housing. And like that, you get to put that in there. And occasionally the writer pushes back. Well, that's not what it's actually called. I don't care.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I don't people understand it.
I do think though that sometimes I think folks that are in power rely on the fact that it's really dense, and will just put a headline that says developer is building affordable housing, right? And that if you don't interrogate that a little bit and say affordable to whom, are we calling 80, of housing that's affordable to 80% of the AMI affordable? Like, is that the definition we're setting, or are we setting it lower or whatever? And so I struggle with that because I think Dan is absolutely right. Like, you have to make it readable to the layperson who doesn't spend a lot of time with it. But I also think that sometimes, not on our end, but on the end of like how the narrative is cast, sometimes oversimplifies things. And like, my beat is technically affordable housing, and I've used it so much that sometimes you're like, when you say a word enough, it doesn't feel like it has any meaning. Like, it feels like that at some point where you're like, well, what does that actually mean? Like, who is actually someone who can afford to live here? And so I think Dan is absolutely right, but I also see the other end where like precision of language matters, of like, who is this actually going to be for, and who is this actually going to affect? And so I think that's our challenge as reporters, is to like get people to say the actual thing, that we can be precise and clear in saying this is actually what's going to be built, because a $1,100 apartment is not affordable to most people in Charlotte, or to many people in Charlotte. And yet sometimes that's branded as, affordable housing. So it's a challenge. I don't have a good answer. If someone does, I would let's talk.
Okay, well, we're coming, we're kind of coming up on time. There are many questions that unfortunately we're not going to be able to get to, but I think one that I always love to hear reporters talk about is just how you pick your stories. There's a lot of power in crafting the narrative and deciding whose stories get told. And unfortunately, that means sometimes deciding whose stories do not get told. Michael, how do you choose what you're going to focus on?
Yeah, so as someone who covers the mayor and the council in DC, and right now we're in budget season, so that has been my primary focus. But around this time, you see lots of interesting proposals, and you were kind of talking about big money earlier and how you manage that. But we're talking millions and billions in dollars in different programs. And actually, this year, Mayor Bowser pitched like 400 million for an affordable housing initiative, which is a record lump sum in the history of the city, I'm pretty sure. So the way I like to approach something like that is to think from a bottom up perspective, like, all right, who are the people who are going to be impacted by this policy that's being pitched, and also not just taking it at face value. So I really appreciated what Lauren pointed out about when the mayor's pitching a project, or she's like at a groundbreaking for a building, and she's saying, oh, all of these units are going to be affordable housing. Like, all right, let's scrutinize that. And I'm going to follow up with a question. I'm like, okay, affordable to whom? Like, what is the percentage of that AMI? What's the breakdown there? What families are going to be able to afford to live here? And then talking to policy experts and people, affordable housing advocates, about what they think of that proposal and whether they think it's going to meet the needs of the community. And oftentimes the answer is no, but it still is helpful to have that context in there rather than just kind of putting out a press release saying this thing's going to happen and not really scrutinizing the proposal. So I think for me, when it comes to housing stories, I'm definitely interested always in when I'm hearing from tenants, or I'm getting a tip from someone who works at a building and they're saying things aren't right here. Like that always is really compelling to me, and I'm grateful for when that happens. But at the same time, there's plenty of ways to scrutinize that through the projects that the city is pushing. And also, where is the city placing its money? Where is the housing? I think Dan alluded to this too, like, where is the housing being built? How are communities being transformed? And not just the traditional, like, this white community is upset about X, Y, and Z, but diving deeper than that. So there's an endless supply truly of ways you can approach the topic. And for me, I think it's usually just looking at that policy perspective and scrutinizing that the best I can.
I want to kind of give everyone a couple of minutes maybe to try to field this question. Alexandria, there's always the stories that you have to cover because it's some huge development. It's something readers want to know about. Everyone's talking about it. But then there are those stories that you really, really want to get to that no one's talking about and maybe only affect a few people, but it feels significant to you. Feels like there's something really there. So how do you get those stories to the top of the pile?
In terms of like pitching them, or
just making the time for them or making the case for them?
I just do them, because if I put them off, I'll never do it.
Right. Okay. Well, Lauren, how do you pick?
That's a really good question. I think that for me, like, having a story that I feel good and invested in is like the best motivator to do stories. And so, although the biggest challenge is to find, I hate the term real people because we're all real people, but non-figureheads with 10 titles behind their name. Those are the stories that like you want to come back to and you're willing to like go to a night meeting or meet somebody on the weekend or whatever. COVID was a challenge. I'll be honest, like Zoom interviews are just not emotionally resonant in the way that like real people are, but I'm hopeful that as we move out of at least the biggest COVID crisis zone, that we can start going to meetings and seeing people in person and like feeling a little more connected to neighborhoods and our journalism again.
Okay, and maybe Dan, you can bring us home. There are, it seems like infinite stories when it comes to planning. So how do you decide on the ones that you're going to write?
As someone who tends to do my own stuff for free and then work for other publications, I have a little more freedom in like deciding what I get to write about. And to be honest, it's like, if there were 10 of me, what's the thing I would be most excited to write about so the other 9 of me can go do those things? That's usually what it ends up being. hopefully one day there will be, that greater core of local journalists to tell all of the stories. But that's a topic for another panel, I guess.
Hopefully there will be 10 of all of you when we figure out that technology. I think that Julie is saying we're out of time here, sadly.
Thank you guys so much. I wish there were 10 of each of you for sure. I wish there were 10 programs like this. I've learned so much. I know everyone who's joined us has learned so much at all. And I know there were questions we didn't get to, and I wish we had more time. The good news is we do have more programs coming up that will touch on some of these issues. So I want to just take a moment to tell you all about them. They will also be available at no cost to you thanks to the Gannett Foundation. So we are putting links in the chat right now to more information about a couple of upcoming programs. One is Think Outside the Classroom, how to diversify education sources and the stories we tell. And one is how op-eds can amplify original voices and engage new communities. We also have other programs coming up that we hope you will find as valuable as today's. And if you did today, and if you do in the future, we encourage you also to support our work. So we'll put a link to donate in the chat. And if you don't have time right now to give, that's okay, because we're going to send it to you again this afternoon, along with the recording of this program and a survey. So you can give us feedback on how this program was for you and on what else we can do to support you. So thank you all again so much. Stay well, and we hope to see you again very soon.